You're listening to the Hazard Ground Podcast, with service members from across the military sharing their stories of combat and survival. And now, here's your host, Mark Zeno.
Welcome into the Hazard Ground Podcast. We always appreciate you joining us each and every week. Before we get to this week's episode, some friendly reminders. Our website is up and running, hazardground.com. You can go there for more information on our guests, pictures, bios. Also, previous episodes are on the website for you guys to listen to, as well as a list of our sponsors for the podcast that keeps us up and running. Want to remind you guys to follow us on all the social media sites as well. Twitter at Hazard Ground, Instagram at Hazard Ground Podcast, and on Facebook at Hazard Ground Podcast. You can keep up with everything we have going on each and every week. This week's episode is brought to you by Blue Apron. Blue Apron delivers all the freshest ingredients and recipes you need in exactly the right proportions to make simple, seasonal home-cooked meals. New recipes are created each week by Blue Apron's culinary team, so you'll learn to cook with new ingredients, cuisines, and cooking techniques. Meals are between 500 and 800 calories and start at just $8.74 per serving. Shipping is always free. I'm telling you, I've used Blue Apron many times already. Their food is delicious. Every sponsor on the Hazard Ground is a product that we've used and will stand behind 100%. Otherwise, we wouldn't waste your time talking about it prior to the episode. Now, for a limited time, new customers get 5 meals free with your first 2 orders. That's 5 meals free with your first 2 orders. So get on over to hazardground.com/sponsors and click on the Blue Apron banner. Remember, support for our sponsors goes right back into the Hazard Ground, making it the best podcast it can possibly be. That's hazardground.com/sponsors. Click on the Blue Apron banner, get the discount, and discover a better way to cook. Now, on to this week's episode. This week's guest is a 20-year veteran as an infantry officer in the United States Army. He had 11 combat deployments overseas, including with the Rangers and Special Operations units. He currently is part of Kenning Associates, a top consulting firm specializing in leadership development, and he is also the author of a book called A Light in the Darkness, Leadership Development for the Unknown. It is J.C. Glick on the Hazard Ground Podcast. J.C., thanks for being here, brother.
Hey, thank you for having me. Really looking forward to talking to you and sharing some stuff.
You know, listen, it's really interesting whenever we get somebody of your background who really specializes in leadership. It's always interesting because there are so many different dynamics to being a leader today, not only in the military, but out of it. And I'm very excited to talk to you about your specific experiences and how you feel, about leadership today versus years ago when you were in. But while we're on that topic, let's back up and get to your start in the military.
Yeah. So, it was pretty average. I went to the University of Rhode Island, and after kind of a trying childhood, felt that I was in college and I really needed to pay back some opportunities I got. So I joined ROTC and went through that whole process. In fact, on the day I graduated, I didn't go to graduation. I just got commissioned and went and had a party because I was really focused on what I wanted to do. It was, I wanted to be an infantry guy. I wanted to go to Ranger school and I wanted to go to the Rangers. Did the normal path, IOBC, Ranger school, did some other schools. I'd done airborne as a cadet, and I was lucky enough to serve in the 82nd as my first assignment. Was able to deploy to Haiti in a support op, and was able to compete in the Best Ranger in 1997. And luckily, I had a commander who had come from the Rangers, and also luckily Stan McChrystal was the regimental commander at the time, and just, to show you the tie there. So we got to know each other in 1997.
What rank was he when you met him?
He was a full colonel,
okay,
and I was a first lieutenant.
Okay.
Because I was a little bit older, because I had previously, before the brigade commander that signed my packet to go to the Rangers, I had a brigade commander that did not sign packets to go to the Ranger Regiment. So I was a little bit older, so I had to get McChrystal's approval. And it's funny because, here we are 21 years later. He wrote the foreword to my book.
Oh, wow.
So he's been kind of a mentor to me, and I've tried to, I've learned so much from so many leaders, but I certainly learned a lot from him and the NCOs that worked with him.
Interesting that my only run-in with General Stanley McChrystal is he signed my Bronze Star for my first deployment.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I was part of CJ Soto for Combined Joint Special Operations Task Force, and I was attached with the 5th Group and 10th Group, and I think he came through once to work with the ODAs, or at least visit him and say hello while we were in Baghdad. But he ended up signing my Bronze Star, and then of course everything went down with McChrystal the way it went down, and it was like, well, that's not really the guy that we remember who put on the uniform every single day. But unfortunately, politics sometimes get in the way.
Yeah, I'll tell you, that guy was, I was fortunate to work with 4 great leaders like Stan McChrystal, Dan Allen, Ferreter.
You work with Ferreter too?
I did. Ferreter
General
was
Mike
my first.
He was my second deployment.
So he was my 3rd Ranger Battalion commander he was the first one I had, and then Dan Allen took over for him. But I kept running into all those guys throughout my career, and was lucky enough to work for McChrystal, both when he was regimental commander, when he was the SOC commander. I mean, so I went right back to the Rangers after company command, and then went to the asymmetric warfare group. I mean, he's been a leader of mine for a very long time. And
everybody listen, I know we're getting off trail here, but this is kind of, it's weird, as big as the Army is and the military is, sometimes it's really, really small. And, General, he was 3-star general. He's Lieutenant General Mike Ferreter. When I met him and my interactions with him were nothing but pleasant. He was one of the nicest general officers you'll ever meet. I mean, he's just a very down-to-earth, humble kind of guy. And I only say that to people listening because a lot of people who haven't rubbed elbows with general officers know that sometimes, you don't get to be that level in any organization doing something for 30 years without being typically of a certain kind of personality type. And the humble, laid back, down to earth guys aren't usually that mold. And so when you find one like General Ferreter, it just stays with you,
So it's funny you say that. So General Ferreter, again, recently crossed paths because we both wrote forwards for another 1st Ranger Battalion's author. So for a guy named Joel Carpenter.
I know Joel. Joel was on the podcast.
Okay. So Joel recently wrote a book, and he asked Nate Self, Mike Ferreter, and myself to write the forwards for it. So it was really kind of neat to do a kind of a project where Ferreter and I are both doing the kind of the forwards for that. But I have been really lucky because you and I have both met those other kind of generals. But the guys like McChrystal and Allen and Ferreter, and I could probably think of a couple others, the Beckers of the world, they're different. They understand that their job is to lead people. Not mission accomplishment is secondary to them because they know that their people will make mission accomplishment happen. I think of the current commander right now who's in Afghanistan, Mick Nicholson. That's who I commanded for as my first command. And look, that guy gets it. He never worried about end state. He worried about taking care of his people. And he knew that if he took care of his people were going to do anything that they needed to do to accomplish.
Right. The end state takes care of it. With General Becker, are you talking about the General Becker that was the DCG of the 25th Infantry Division under Bernard Champeau?
Brad Becker.
Yep. Yeah. Yep. He was on my second deployment as well. I had a lot of contact. It's uncanny. Okay. We've gotten off track here. I just can't believe we know exactly all the same people throughout our careers. Anyway, so yeah, Brad Becker was he would come into the gym and work out with us. Like he was just a regular Joe. It was weird, but it wasn't because he's like a general officer. So you're expecting him to kind of just lock everything up and he's just sitting there working out with you. Like he's just a regular guy. Anyway, I didn't mean to get off track. Right. Let's get back to your story.
Look, I got to be honest with you. I think that talking about these guys is talking about my story. These guys, and then as importantly, or probably more importantly, the NCOs at either their level or my level. I mean, and I think of the the Sergeant Major Halls and the Sergeant Major Birches and the Sergeant Major Cannells. And I mean, you sit there, the Sergeant Major Merritts, the Ferruccis, and you sit there and you're like, how could you not learn from those guys?
Yeah.
And understand what real leadership was. And I think that it was seeing all of them and realizing, holy cow, this is really, I've been really lucky because at the end of my career, I probably worked for probably the worst officer the worst leader I had ever come in contact with. And I mean, it was toxic. And, you know, I'm sure that I had my fair share of culpability in that relationship. But what I realized was I had really been lucky throughout my career to work for just tremendous leaders and work with tremendous leaders and learn from the best leaders in the world. And that's why, I mean, I decided to write the book and the book is dedicated to every NCO that I've ever had the privilege of serving with, because NCOs, they're the ones that are leading up, down, and sideways, right? And they do it. The good ones do it in this uncanny way that you really don't even understand you're being led, but they're taking care of everybody and they're doing, you know, they're not worried about PT belts and grass. They're worried about preparing people for combat. They're worrying about making sure that they create the right atmosphere and the right environment for people to become their absolute best. And
you know, what's interesting, JC, and I'm sorry to cut you off when you talk about NCOs, and the military folks listening will understand this, and it's no disrespect to the NCO Corps, but there are a lot of, you know, E7s, E89s who worry about the rocks next to the grass and what, you know, whether your PT belt is the right color and what length your socks are, and all that's fine and good. And no one has ever said that standards aren't important. But the other side of that equation, and really, I think this is what makes the Army a unique organization and a unique corporate culture, because there are more laid back individuals. You know, for myself, considering I'm a lieutenant colonel, like I think I'm fairly laid back. I have a much different leadership style than many of other guys who wear the same rank, who want to, you know, constantly flex their muscle. Now, I'm with you. I'm about empowering people. And I think when you find NCOs who really get that working with somebody side by side and trying to bring out the best features and best qualities of that individual is really what separates I guess from sergeants from NCOs, in my opinion. And I just think that's a part that gets overlooked. And those rare people balance out the organization and kind of give you those pockets of humanity that sometimes the military strips us all of.
No, I think you're spot on there. I think I certainly had a very different style than a lot of guys. I just tried to be me. And, you know, look, I'm not the smartest guy. I know that I'm surrounded by smart guys in most of the units that I was in. And I believed that if we give people the ability to make mistakes and think through things, they're going to innovate and they're going to be better than we could ever imagine. You know, nobody's arguing about the requirement for standards. Well, I mean, I'll tell you something that when I was, you know, at Fort Jackson and doing basic training, I'll tell you, I talk about it today. I talk about the fallacy of standards, because standards are this comfort thing that leaders get. It's really a management tool. It's not a leadership tool. It's this idea that as long as they can get this, we're good. And what we don't realize is that ceiling quickly becomes the floor, and people stop trying after they've made the standard. I mean, most soldiers, once they know they can pass the PT test, you know, and I'm not talking about guys in elite units. I'm talking about just the average soldier.
Sure.
Once they know they can pass it, they don't worry about it anymore. They don't think about it. It doesn't breed that mentality doesn't breed a culture of fitness. It breeds a culture of obedience
and maintenance more than anything. It's just let me maintain.
Right. I can do X number of push-ups. I can do X number of sit-ups, and I can run in X time. And the problem is that you and I both know that has nothing to do with the requirements of a soldier in combat. And it really just it creates this idea of mediocrity. So I'm very big on, you know, let's not give people standards. Let's see what they can do, and let's see what they come up with. and you'll quickly find out who struggles and who doesn't. But more often than not, there's fewer that struggle than the other way around. And I've seen this in the military. I certainly saw it as my military career continued. And now I see it in the civilian world. When I work, I'm very, very fortunate. Work with professional football teams, professional basketball teams, NCAA Division I programs, and then really high level companies, Xbox, et cetera. And when you tell people, hey, let's try to get rid of this standard. Let's ask them, hey, I know you can do this. Let's see how well you can do it. I'll tell you what, people will never, ever fail to surprise you and make you pleased.
I concur wholeheartedly. I mean, it's refreshing to hear. And I think you talk about it both in the military and the civilian world. When it comes to leadership, so often it's the standards that kind of hold us back. And they don't allow for people to do anything else. Like we always hear about it, even the civilians know this. Well, the Army's goal is to break you down to a bare bones minimum and then build you back up. And when they build you back up, they kind of essentially want to build all the same people. Well, there's some flaws to that logic. I mean, it makes sense to a certain extent in combat because we all want to be trained the same way. But not every combat scenario, as we've learned from doing this podcast for over a year, there's no combat scenario that's goes the way we train, and nor are any two combat scenarios alike. And so from that standpoint, when you have to inject humans into the situation, they're not robots. They have to make decisions based off of the information that they have and what they know. And I think if you train these people to be better thinkers and train them to be better equipped to handle diversity and handle complex scenarios as opposed to some sort of baseline, I think we're a better organization for it. I think we're starting to transition to that. But still, there's an old guard that kind of hangs with it's like a cat with their claws in the rug to, well, these are the standards and these are what we have to hold to.
So that's exactly what the book is about. 16 Rangers were selected to go to TRADOC in my command board. And we all kind of talked to each other and went, what the heck just happened? I mean, we're all from the regiment and we're all getting training battalions, which is our own thing because we said we'd take any kind of battalion. And General Dempsey wrote this great note saying, I want to put proven warfighters in TRADOC. I want to change how TRADOC trains. I want to change. And it was a great idea. It really was a great idea. I wish General Dempsey, before he became chairman, had told the people who worked above us that he wanted things changed. Because for 18 months, I spent going toe-to-toe with colonels and senior officers and even and in a lot of cases senior NCOs on getting guys to stop being obedient and start being disciplined. Right? Obedience is I shine my boots because I don't want to get yelled at. I clean my weapon because it's the right thing to do. So this idea of, hey, how do we get guys away from obedience? Because the problem with obedience and battle drills and all that kind of stuff is soldiers will do it. And I tell this story in the book about, a unit, a transportation unit that, before it goes out on its convoy, it must have rehearsed 100 times on actions on contact. I mean, just if you watch this organization and this is 2007, if you watch this organization, you sit there and you go, that is the heat. That unit is that unit is to the standard. And then not 2 miles down the road, they get hit with a complex ambush. And in the rehearsals, if you're on the right side of the truck, you go off the right side. If you're on the left side of the truck, you go off the left side. And they got hit, and the bullets were coming from the right side. So you'd think everybody go off the left side, except no. What they did was the right side of the truck went off the right side, and the left side of the truck went off the left side. They did exactly what they were told. And that's because that's how we trained. So what I tried to do, and really it was the drill sergeants that did it, is we changed all that. We said, we're going to make these guys think. We're going to change. We're going to completely flip the script on how they do things. And the drill sergeants came up with it. And so for 18 months, the battalion got beat up. And then a guy named Dob Seidman, who wrote the book How, had heard what, I had a really good friend who was working with them, and we talked anyway. He heard what we were doing. He came down to, because it was very much like his book. And he did an article in Forbes that's still one of the most read articles online at Forbes, saying Army basic training isn't so basic anymore. And overnight, so the next day, General Odierna, who is the chief, wrote on his Facebook page what Colonel Glick and his drill sergeants are doing at Fort Jackson and 239 is what we all ought to be doing. And overnight, everything was okay. We were completely correct. And my next job was to, help rewrite, how we do basic training. And I saw kind of the humor of, oh my gosh, for 18 months, it was miserable. 18 months of my command were miserable, just fighting people, because I literally had a general officer tell me, if you get a can of Coke in Cleveland or you get a can of Coke that's made in California, they both taste like cans of Coke. And I said, but these are people. These are humans. You can have you can have two kids in the same platoon, and their experiences at basic training are going to be vastly different.
Yeah.
Because of their strengths and their weaknesses in this. So it was funny. I watched Fox News a couple days ago, and they're like, oh yeah, the Army's changing and they're doing this. Yeah, we started that 5 years ago. We're finally getting around to implementing it, because quite honestly, there was a lot of fighting. There were people like, you got to drill in ceremony. Well, okay. Because that teaches discipline. No, it doesn't. It teaches mass obedience. But fine, whatever. We'd make concessions to get guys, to get the other things that we wanted to do, so that soldiers could think and they could, shoot, move, communicate, and medicate, and they were ready to go to combat.
And as soon as you use the Coke can, it's that linear thinking. That example is from an individual who grew up in that mass obedience environment, because that's all they knew, and that's all they can regurgitate, and it's a vicious cycle. And look, we could go on and on for hours about this. I'm fascinated by it. I certainly would love to talk more about it, and we'll get into it. But I do want to get back to kind of the literal story of your career and going forward, because I think it's important to understand everything that we just talked about and how you got to that point. So let's talk about your first experience. You got to Ranger School and you got through that, and after that, did you know you wanted to go into Special Forces, or was that something that you were selected for? How did that come about?
Look, I knew I wanted to be in the Rangers from the time I was a cadet. I wanted to serve in the Ranger Regiment because I had always been told that those were the best guys to serve with, and that was correct. One of my biggest problems was, after I left the 82nd, went to the Rangers, I got to stay in 3rd Battalion. I mean, my branch manager called me. I had been a captain. I was still there. He's like, hey, if you don't go to this next class, you're going to have to leave the Army for the career course.
Really?
And so I went kicking and screaming. I did my 18 months of command time in the conventional force and went right back to the regiment. My biggest problem was my goal was always to be a company commander in the Ranger Regiment. And I accomplished it, and then was selected for the Naval War College. And I went, I have no idea what I want to do now.
So what year is this, JC? Like what time frame are we talking?
So let's see. I left to go to the Naval War College in 2000. So I was at the Naval War College 2005 to 2006.
Okay, so but just back up for a second. 9/11 happens. Where are you? When are you? And how quickly do you end up deploying? Because the Rangers was some of the first guys over.
Right. So I was, when 9/11 occurred, I was actually with 1st Battalion, 23rd Infantry. We were out in the field doing a live fire exercise. And my packet had already been accepted at the regiment, and I was finishing up my command. 3 months later, I was the regimental air officer for the 75th Ranger Regiment. And assisting in the continuing deployment of the Ranger Regiment in Afghanistan, and planning the initial invasion of Iraq shortly thereafter.
Wow. That's a pretty cool assignment.
It was neat. It was again great. Joe Votel was a regimental commander, and he was a great guy to work for. Another guy who gets it, KK Chin, was the deputy commander. I mean, it was nothing but talent at the regiment at that time, and we were really completely focused.
So when you're in the
So
planning stages of all this, are you the guy who's like, well, I need to get in the action kind of guy, or you content kind of being at that
no,
strategic level?
no, I wanted to be down there at the company, and the problem was, um, we had done this operation called Winter Strike in Afghanistan, and it was the first time the entire regiment had deployed ever. And I was the air officer for that. And I finished that. And at the time, Mike Kershaw was the 1st Ranger Battalion commander, and he said, "Hey, come down and be a company commander." So I was ready to get down to 1st Battalion and do work. And Colonel Votel, General Votel now, said, "Yeah, I got an air that just moved the entire regiment. He's staying up here until we're through a couple other things." And no, I did not want to be at that level. I wanted to be down at a company as fast as I could.
Looking back on it and seeing how everything unfolded, when you go through that whole experience in your mind, what's the takeaway? I mean, is there pride in all that?
I think what I'm proud of is the people that I worked with. I mean, that's what I'm really proud to say that, who I worked for, who I worked with, the non-commissioned officers that I assisted get to, different places, the different planning, the other special operations units that I was able to facilitate air for. That's what I'm proud of. Anybody could have done what I did, and probably honestly done it better. I was just really, really proud to be side by side with the folks I was with, and recognized how lucky I was. So now that didn't mean I wanted to be at that position, but it's funny, when you're coming to the regiment, you're like, "Hey, I'll mop the floors if I have to," and you quickly remember, I said I'd mop the floors, and this is kind of worse than mopping the floors, but I said I'd do anything to serve the regiment. And I think what I started to do was realize that I was working for the Ranger on the ground. It wasn't about, making the 3 happy. It wasn't about making the commander happy. It was about making sure that those Rangers got to where they needed to go, and things worked out. Air is a tough job, and the Ranger Regiment, I'm sure it's as tough as if you're in the 101st or the 82nd. I'm sure it's just different challenges. But it was, yeah. I much I would have preferred to have been down a little bit lower, but I got there. I was able to, command Charlie Company 175 under Colonel Clark, now General Clark. And that was and Command Sergeant Major Hardy, who had been my first sergeant in Charlie Company 375. So it was great, and I had great Rangers. I had the best Rangers you could ever want.
So when do you get to kind of download all this experience and knowledge that you have into actual physical action?
I'll tell you, I don't know that I ever stopped doing that. So it's funny. I got to back up a little bit. I told you about doing that Haiti deployment before I went to the regiment, and I learned so much in that Haiti deployment. And that's where I first saw that we weren't preparing soldiers to think. And it was where I first started kind of challenging the norms of what we had been doing. Because up to that point, I think I was pretty happy with the norms. But once I saw Haiti, and then the things that I learned in Haiti, I was able to use in training up through, not up till 9/11. And then 9/11, I had, for the first part of that war, I had a front row seat to what was going on, and being there with the units that were executing, because the air is obviously part of the TAC. And so being able to kind of have a front row seat to that. So I had kept all of it, everything that worked and everything that I thought, yeah, I don't like that. I don't want to do that. I want to do this. Or, hey, they're not empowering their Rangers enough. I want to empower my Rangers. And not to mention, you get to learn as the air. I get to learn from all the 1st Battalion guys, the 2nd Battalion guys, and the 3rd Battalion guys, as well as the guys of the regiment, and being able to sit and talk to Sergeant Major Birch, who was probably one of the best warriors the regiment has ever seen. And just pick his brain like, hey, this just happened. What do you think? What would you have recommended? What would you have done? And then, so when I took command, first with, Ferrucci was my first sergeant, and now he's the 82nd Airborne Division Command Sergeant Major. And then, Mike Masson was my second first sergeant, and now I believe he's the Sergeant Major of the Asymmetric Warfare Group. Those are 2 experienced warfighters, and we just jumped in and started running. And we, our first conversations were always, okay, this is what I saw. This is what I think. What did you see? What do you think? And because of that, I think the company was very, very successful.
Okay. So, what is your first actual experience in combat itself?
Let's see. Well, I was in Winter Strike. So what's that? 02.
Mm-hmm.
And then continued to deploy to Afghanistan through 02, 03. I was on the initial invasion into the western portion of Iraq.
Well, and the only reason I asked this, well, go ahead, finish your last part. Go ahead.
And then did Iraq and Afghanistan, bouncing back and forth until I think my last deployment with the regiment, which was 5 deployments, was we were in Afghanistan in 05.
Okay, so in all these experiences and thinking the way you think, did you see the kind of obedience that you were talking about before unfold in combat in negative ways?
I did not see it with the Ranger Regiment.
Okay.
Not up to then. No, I did not. I saw guys who learned every single time something happened. There wasn't this idea of obedience. There was this idea of innovate, get better. We can go faster. We can perform at a higher level. I think when I first saw it, so after I left the War College, I went to SFOD selection and blew out my knee during selection, and was terrified that I was going to end up going to, I don't know, wherever the Army needed me. And again, luckily having worked for Dan Allen was in charge of ops in the Army, and they were starting the asymmetric warfare group, and Birch was the sergeant major. And I went to that selection and was selected, went to OTC. And that's when I started to see when you were passing through units and you were looking at what they were doing, I realized, holy cow, because up to that point, I mean, I'd been so lucky, right? I've been in the 82nd, I've been in the Rangers, and I'd been in this unit that was, the Strikers, which was just starting, and we were given free rein to command the way we wanted to command. And then I got to see the rest of the Army, which up to that point, I just heard stories.
Sure.
I mean, we didn't even operate with them, right? I mean, we were operating at night, everybody else was doing the day. I mean, I didn't see anybody else. So here I am, a major, and it's like I'm finally seeing what the rest of the Army is doing. And I go, oh, and it's not their fault. Like, these are not bad people. These are not dumb soldiers. These are not dumb officers. These are not dumb NCOs. These are people who are pegged inside this very confined box, and with leaders that won't let them operate because they're afraid of the risk. But the risk was so much greater by not letting them operate. Yeah. And so my 6th deployment in 2007 with AWG, when I went, almost all over Iraq working with units and half of Afghanistan, I went, I can't believe this is where we're at. Not that I thought less of them, but that I did think less of some of their leadership.
It's funny you talk about that. And, my experience in the Army, active duty in a logistics world as my, a logistics officer by trade. And then I got out and I went to the Guard, and then I deployed after 9/11 in 2005 and 2006. And I was fortunate enough to be attached to, as I mentioned before, the Special Forces. And that opened my eyes to a whole different world. And it's funny, I always tell people, I didn't know about Special Forces when I was on active duty. If somebody would have told me, I certainly would have signed up, because it was more my mentality. It was more my speed. I don't know if physically I would have lasted, because at that point, early on in my career, like you said, I did my best I could on my PT test, but I just never really tried anything further because I was just more into athletics per se, as opposed to PT. Anyway, I'm digressing, but my point is that when I got to the Special Forces world, and I realized that nobody was going to sit there and tell me how to do a job. They just told me what they needed and allowed me the room to figure it out on my own. And then I began to understand more and more. And after I had left that deployment and I had gotten back, and oh, by the way, they tasked me with things that I would have never in my wildest dreams could have ever thought that me, a captain at that point in time, would have ever done. I mean, I joke with people who said, I saw more combat experience than 75% of the infantry during that deployment. Because all the guys were doing was guarding gates and guarding prisons and everything else. And me, I'm driving around Baghdad for 6,000 miles with my hair on fire and running through the streets like I'm some sort of infantry guy. It was nothing I was ever trained for, but it's what the mission called for. And as long as I was allowed to do it and do it successfully, they just kept asking me to do more. And that's how I knew I was doing it right. Because I learned very quickly in that environment that they don't have time to teach you things. They don't have time to hold your hand through stuff. They just want the job done. And really, as long as it's not illegal, immoral, or unethical, as long as you get it done, then they'll give you another task. And if you can thrive in that environment, then you're okay. But when you take that mentality back to the regular army, because after you get back from deployment and you try to download all this knowledge, you meet with so much resistance. And it's like, man, this is a different army that I'm in.
Yeah. So it's amazing, right? And I actually just did a video series on giving guidance, and I talk about this idea of think outside the box. Think outside the box is what we're telling people. It's really horrible freaking guidance. It's garbage, right? It's a bumper sticker, because if you're a baseball pitcher, and your coach is like, look, I want us to get better. Think outside the box. How we get better, and the pitcher comes up and goes, oh, I think we could be better if I stood 20 feet in front of the rubber. No. That would be against the rules. You got to stand on the rubber. So what I tell people is, look, I need you to think inside the box. The box is what's legal, ethical, moral, and safe. And here's the deal. If you think you're going to cross one of those lines, I need you to talk to me. If you don't think you're going to cross one of those lines, do whatever you want to do. And because what I found is subordinates boxes are almost always smaller than ours. They always think, usually you have to push them, and you're like, oh, no, you can keep doing this because that's plenty safe. Keep going. You're good. Keep going. But I always say, hey, you can do anything you want inside the box. And we have things that are legal and ethical and moral. And the safe thing, it runs, I accepted a lot of risk on most things. And my line was way farther than most of my subordinates. And eventually they start to push out and push out and push out. If they get too close or they cross over a little bit, well, that's okay. That's what leaders are there for. You go, hey, come here. I mean, we forget that our subordinates aren't there to protect their careers. We're there to develop them. And we're supposed to underwrite when we're supposed to celebrate when they make mistakes. As long as those mistakes aren't born of negligence, we're supposed to say, yeah, hey, you made a mistake. It's all right. Don't do that dumb thing again. I mean, that's what good leaders do. And I saw so much in the bigger army, and certainly, unfortunately, at TRADOC. And again, I did, Becker was at TRADOC. I loved Becker. There were some really great, the Meyerwiches of the world. There were some really tremendous leaders. But you sit there and I worked for one guy who was so risk averse. He's like, well, we should paint the bottom of the magazines that have live ammo in them red. And I said, sir, that's not gonna happen in combat. He's like, well, they're basic training. I'm like, great. We're gonna get these kids. All they're gonna see is red bottoms of magazines. They're gonna get to their first assignment and go, why aren't these magazines red? So we got to teach them what live ammo looks like from the top, not from the bottom of their magazines. But it was this idea that we had to, put these so much control measures on people. And the problem, as you know, when you put too many control measures on guys, they don't develop. They just do what they're told to do. And obviously that we can't do that. So I'd like to say that I took every combat deployment, and again, very happy to consistently be at the front of the action where the Rangers were and then where AWG was, but take everything that I learned and it helped develop my leadership ideas and how I now try to transfer that on to the people that I'm lucky enough to work with.
JC, when you talk about making mistakes and allowing people latitude to make mistakes, that's a different equation in combat. Just because people's lives are so much more on the line. Like you talk about illegal, moral, and ethical. Well, sometimes illegal, moral, and ethical doesn't even matter in combat because it's the ultimate equalizer of everything. And I don't know if it happened. And if you have an experience, please share it. But when it comes to combat and allowing people to make mistakes and think on their own and go outside of what would be considered norms or training, how do you reconcile that?
Yeah. I do have some stories, but I'll tell you this one instead. Instead of a war story, I'll tell you some great guidance that was given to me because I think it's more meaningful, or at least it's more meaningful to me. I was going for my 5th deployment, and I was a company commander in the regiment, and the battalion commander says, all right, what are your goals? You know the drill. What are you going to do during this deployment, et cetera. And I give them, hey, I'm going to do this, sir. I'm going to do this, and I want to do this, and I'm going to bring all my guys back home. And he looks at me and he goes, yeah, that's the dumbest goal you can possibly have. And I'm shocked, right? Because since I've been a cadet, what do we get told? Every body bag is your mistake. That's your fault as a leader. And he says, hey, JC, I got a couple concerns with that. And here's what they are. One, if you're worried about keeping all your guys alive, you may not do what needs to be done for the mission. You can keep all your guys alive staying on the combat outpost. You can keep all your guys. Heck, we can keep all the guys alive, maybe, if we don't train and just stay here. So I worry when you say that if something comes up and you have to do the mission, you have to accomplish the mission, what's your priority? And I was like, well, sir, of course we're going to do what we have to do. And he said, I know that, but when you say stuff like that, and here's the other thing, if you can do everything right in combat, you can have the best intel and be making the best decisions based on what you know, but the enemy gets a vote. And you can do everything right, and your men are going to die. And here's what I'm going to tell you, JC. If your men die and it's not born from your negligence, meaning you should have known something or you should have done something or you should have prepared in a certain way, if it's not born from your negligence, it's okay. Now, that sounds shocking to those who have not been in combat.
Well, no, but the converse is true as well, because you could do 100 things wrong and still get out alive. So, because I've said it all the time, I say it repeatedly on the pod, that exact thing. The reason I'm still here today wasn't because I did something right and somebody else who died did something wrong. And it wasn't because they did something wrong and I did something right. War is random. Combat is random. It takes all of that away from you. And as you said succinctly, the enemy gets a vote. And that's not anything you can train or plan for because you don't know what their decision is. And I didn't mean to cut you off, but it's so true when you say that not everything is always your fault. I know we feel like it's our fault sometimes, but the random nature of war and why the bullet went 2 inches past me as opposed to the right as opposed to 2 more inches to the left and hit me, I don't have an answer for. I don't.
That's it. And I think of some of the things that I was lucky enough to walk away from and that my men were lucky enough to walk away from and think of, Now imagine this from a leadership perspective, right? This senior leader just told his subordinate leader that his mistake could be so catastrophic that someone dies. And as long as it's not due to negligence, it's okay. Now I was free to really think about mission accomplishment, right? Now I was free. And it didn't mean that I was any less thoughtful with my guys. I can literally say, as I'm sure you can, as anybody who served, I truly loved everybody I've ever served with. I mean, they were the closest parts of my life. But the ability to think differently because I wasn't worried about making a mistake. And I did watch, unfortunately, brother commanders who did lose guys and weren't told the same thing as I was told by their battalion commander. And they became combat ineffective for the rest of their guys. And that's a shame, right? That's because very few times did I think they were negligent. I'm not saying they never were, but very few times did I think they were negligent.
My only fear in combat was that it wasn't even negligence, that I did what I was trained to. Like, it was more concerned about myself and doing my job correct. Because I kind of figured in that same mantra that if everybody thought about doing their job correctly, then a lot of the other things would take care of itself. Yeah, it's inherent for me to take care of my buddy and all the great things, fall on the grenade, dive in front of it, whatever it may be. All that stuff is true. But as a leader, for me, it was about me making the right decisions that were in the best interest of mission accomplishment and the safety of my men that I was outside the wire with. And that was always my concern, was that I was always afraid I was going to lock up or I was going to do the wrong thing or panic. Like, that was the only thing that ever consumed me as a leader that I thought would lead to negligence or lead to a bad decision. I don't know if that makes any sense or not.
No, it does. It does. I can't say that, when you're, I guess I always realize, look, there's smart rangers and strong rangers, and I can bench press a lot of weight. I was always I didn't worry about making the right decisions, because by the time the decision got to me, it was so simple. It was like, oh yeah, do this. I'm sorry
to cut you off. You know where I think a lot of that came from for me? See, I wasn't an infantry officer. I was operating in a realm that was not my area of expertise. But a lot of people put faith in me and trusted, like all those special ops guys put faith in me and trusted me to handle this, and letting them down and doing the wrong thing and not living up to, we go back to that whole standard thing, but not living up to what they saw as a level of acceptable responsibility is really kind of what I think drove me to a certain point to always make sure that I was worried about, hey, if this happens, do this. If this happens, do this. Because I kind of felt like I was chasing a ghost, so to speak, in that standard, where I wanted to, I wasn't tabbed and I didn't go through all that, but I wanted those guys to respect me. So I just wanted to make sure I never allowed myself to fall short. I think that's where that fear came from.
That makes sense. And that must have been really hard to feel like, and what I can tell you, as I know you learned in that environment, because people are always like, oh, how do you feel about women and doing this? And look, I don't look at people with what they have on their uniforms or what sex they are or what color they are. I look at what you bring to the team. And it probably shouldn't be the same things I bring to the team, because that's just redundancy. I want to know, what do you bring to the team? How do you make the team better? And it doesn't need to look like what I do. And it took me, it's a combat for me to probably get away, because I'm sure that if you talk to people who knew me as a young lieutenant, I had my tab and I was like, if you don't have your tab, what's up? And boy, was I wrong. But I mean, I'm glad I can look back now and say I was wrong. But what I learned was, man, everybody's bringing something different to the table. And I just appreciate when you bring stuff to the table. It's the people that don't bring anything to the table. I don't care what you got on your uniform. I don't care what gender you are. I don't care what color you are. If you bring nothing to the table, I'm really not sure what use I have for you.
No, yeah, it's 100% clear. So I'm sorry, but I wanted to go back and finish. I know we got off on a tangent. Go back and finish
No,
the
no.
story about you were telling about as far as, not a war story, but the other part of it.
Yeah. So I think, and really, I think we got to the main part of it, which was, this guy who I truly respect to this day, one of the best leaders I ever worked for, able to free me up and understanding that if a man like that can, and by the way, right, those are his Rangers as well. When he can look me in the eye and say, your men are going to die, our men are going to die, it's going to be based on the decision that you make sometimes. And as long as that's not born in negligence, it's okay. Well, now, I mean, when I get to talk to, whether it's a professional football coach or a collegiate football coach or a CEO and say, can't your person make a mistake? I mean, if I was allowed to make a mistake that would have meant that a family didn't have their child anymore, can't you make a mistake that might cost you a little bit of money? That might bring you back 5 yards. Everybody says it's funny because a lot of the clients I work with, hey, we're a production-based organization. Yeah, I got it. Guess what? I lived in the biggest production-based organization in the world, and you know what? I want to see everybody produce, but to produce and get to the next level, you got to make mistakes because you can't innovate if you don't make mistakes. Yeah, you can't get better if you don't make mistakes.
It's funny that somebody speaking to you, somebody of your experience would be that tone deaf to tell you, yeah, we're a results-based organization. Oh, you sure? Okay. Yeah. Because as if you didn't understand what that meant.
Anyway. Oh, you would actually be very, very surprised with what I get, with what I hear people tell me about, especially, as a leadership advisor in this world. And there's a few of us, but there aren't many of us. And I got to be honest, my book was specifically, I wrote it in the third person because I don't want it to be about me and my war stories. I want it to be about ideas on how you make people better. I'm writing my second book right now called Meditations of a Ranger, kind of off Marcus Aurelius meditations. And again, it's all third person. It's like, hey, you need to think about this, because I think that we've gotten to a place where, and I know everybody likes a story, and that's good. And I try to include stories. I don't say whether they're mine or not. But I think what's important is, how do you apply whatever I learn in combat? How do you apply it in the classroom? How do you apply it on the sports field? How do you apply it in the business world? I'm less concerned with how the military applies it now, because they got it and they're on it and they're doing what they need to do. But I think being able to translate but I get told all the time, well, you don't really understand what we have to accomplish here. I'm like, yeah, I got it. I tell this funny story. I was working, it was one of the first things I got to do. I was doing some advisory work with the NFL. And I was meeting with the NFL legends, and we were talking about a number of different things, openly gay players in the NFL, use of the N-word, and hazing or bullying, which all of those three things to me was, I can't believe, like, this is really simple, right? You can't bully a 300-pound man because you're either doing something illegal or you have to get over it. There are some other things that go on, but at the end of the day, come on, let's make sure that we're looking at this right. The use of the N-word was a huge issue, and you sit there and you come from an organization that's colorless, and you go, either everybody can say it or nobody can say it. It's one of those two things. You can't let some people say it and other people, if they work for the same organization. It's either all or nothing. But so we were talking about these things, and we were talking about how players behave and professionalism. And they were saying, well, we're entertainers and we're this. I'm like, well, wait a second. Why? I'm talking to this giant, and I don't think a whole lot of guys, I'm not a small guy, but this guy, like, I felt small around this guy. He's a defensive end. And I said, look, why do you get so excited and dance around like fools and slap each other on the butts when you sack a quarterback? And he looks at me and he goes, because it's really hard to do. And I said, you're right. It's pretty easy to seize an objective with other dudes shooting at you as you fast rope down a fast rope and, seize an objective. You're right. I probably don't have any idea. And he kind of looks at me and goes, okay, point taken. And I'll tell you, I've been able to, I've been really, really fortunate working with the Carolina Panthers and Coach Rivera. and they've really embraced a lot of that. If you watch on the defensive side of the ball, for sure, there's not, they're passionate, they're excited, but there's not this foolishness of they get up, especially if you watch the D line, they do their job and they get up to get ready to do it again. And that's, and I'm glad because, it's very interesting, how everybody kind of sees their place in the world is unique, and that's good. I like that. But man, there's a lot of stuff that I'm able to carry over from my 20 years, and to give to these other folks. And I think it is important to provide that, the adaptive thinking, the resiliency, the leadership that's about people first, all those things. It doesn't matter what industry you're in.
Hey, JC, since you brought it up, you went into consulting in your post-military career, but how did you know that it was time to hang up the boots and say, hey, I'm done being in the Army?
So in honesty, there was a couple of things. One, I was diagnosed with severe post-traumatic stress disorder. And I attempted suicide 4 times. Nobody lets you know about when you're going to combat, there's no problems, right? When you're going to combat every 3 or 4 months, you don't have any issues because you don't have time to have issues. You're doing exactly what you're supposed to be doing. When you stop going to combat, I found I had some issues, particularly about 15 months after I did my last deployment. But after it was while I was in command, and it was recommended that I be medically retired, and I fought that, and I was able to stay. So I kind of saw the writing on the wall. I don't know, there was still a little, at the time, I think there was a lot more stigma associated with the injury than there should have been, because I thought I was still very good at my job. I just really struggled with some other stuff. I mean, it was really transparent. I don't even think that until I was very open with my drill sergeants after I changed command, they didn't even know. And nor did my command.
Was it your combat experience that led you to the PTSD? I mean, is it that clear to say?
Yeah.
When go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, when you look back on it, did the combat experience, did the bad or did the good outweigh the bad?
Yeah. Oh, no. See, that's the thing is, it wasn't. I had a great psych. It wasn't, I didn't feel like survivor's guilt, or I wasn't remorseful for the things that I had done. I'll tell you what it was, is I missed the crap out of what I was doing. I had purpose. Everything was very clear, right? You knew that. Hey, you go outside the gate, you do your business. The business is very clear, right? It's this side or this side, and maybe you're figuring it out on the fly, but still the lines are pretty easy to see in a combat experience. And you get back, and all of a sudden you think something's wrong with you because you missed that. And I lacked purpose, right? The purpose was so clear before. I mean, I was doing what I was supposed to do. I was taking care of bad guys. I was leading men to take care of bad guys. The purpose was so clear, and the purpose becomes less clear, or at least to me. Everybody's experience, I know, is different. But for me, the purpose was less clear. It wasn't the trauma of anything I had done, in my mind. It was the trauma of no longer doing those things, of no longer having a purpose. And feeling, quite honestly, a little, I lived in a Nerf world, right? Nothing was dangerous anymore. Nothing was hard. It was.
Did that lead to emptiness? Is that what kind of led down the suicide road?
It was completely. I absolutely. I didn't have anything, and I was angry. I was angry all the time. What led to the suicide road was I was angry all the time because I didn't have a purpose, and I was working for some folks that couldn't comprehend, because they hadn't, by that time, if you're an '06, maybe you'd done 2 deployments, but that '06 had only seen the inside of a TOC. He never saw a target in his life.
Yeah.
So our experiences were very, very different, since I'd been there since I was a captain. And even once I was a major, I was in small groups out with units, engaging with the enemy. So they wouldn't understand. And I was frustrated. And so I lacked purpose. And because of that anger, I'm very, very close with my children. I mean, I have 3 beautiful children who I'm very, very proud of. I always have been. I've never, hit my kids. I think they've gotten spankings, like collectively, all 3 of them 5 times, because I was actually abused as a child, so I didn't want to hit them. And I found myself yelling at them for absolutely no reason, right? Like my son once couldn't swallow a pill. He's like 12 years old, and I'm chewing his ass because he can't swallow a pill. And in my head, I'm going, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? Stop doing this. But I couldn't stop. And, my daughter would do something like, she would interrupt. She's a 15, 16-year-old girl, and she would interrupt something I was saying, and I would lose my mind. And I was truly concerned that I was making their lives more of a burden than it deserved to be, because I couldn't get my shit together. And that's where that came from. That's wow. That's why suicide seemed like an option. Because I just was, I was angry because I wasn't doing what I should have been doing anymore. I didn't have a purpose. I couldn't get through to people, which was probably my fault for not communicating effectively. And then I treat these people that I think are the greatest people in the world poorly, and I can see myself doing it. It's almost like if you're in a dream, you're doing it, you can't stop. And so that's where that came from. I worked with a great psych, and at one point I was on like 24 different meds.
Wow.
I now only have to take one. I used a service dog. And now he doesn't get worked as much as he should, because I really do feel a lot better. I don't, not every day is awesome. Nights are still a little tough, but I'm much less anxious, I'm not angry at all anymore. I really took a proactive role in my recovery.
Well, listen, 1, I appreciate you sharing and being so candid and honest. And 2, I applaud your courage. It's not easy. And anybody who's been through it on the PTSD world, knows how hard it is. But for those who haven't, it's impossible to explain how your mind can overtake everything in your life when you deal with the level of things that we have dealt with in combat and beyond, and even the way you look at it, because there's a lot of people on the podcast we talk to about survivor's guilt and how that consumes them, and flashbacks and tremors and things of that. That's typically what people think of, but there is a whole nother level, as you have pointed out in your specific case, that emptiness is a big part, and purpose. It's what we live for in the military. Everything has a purpose. Every task, even we talk going back to standards, everything has a purpose. Everything has a bigger picture and a bigger goal. When you remove that, there is a certain sense of searching for something you can never find, and that is very, very emotionally, disturbing. It's just, I don't know if people outside the military can understand it. I know people who are in the military can, but I just wanted to thank you for sharing it, and certainly take a moment to applaud your courage. And I'm for your kids' sake, as a parent, I'm glad you're still here. I'm glad you're still kicking it around, man.
Yeah, I am too. And it was, I never question. I get to talk to a lot of vets now who are struggling, and I share, and because I do know that, hey, that seems like a really viable solution. I don't buy this. Oh, it's a coward's way out. It's not a solution. Hey, stop it. It's special operations forces have the highest rate of suicide of any soldiers, because they do have the courage to do it. They're trying to solve a problem. They see a problem and they want to solve it. I again was really lucky because I also reached out to some friends who worked in our community, and they were able to share, like, I didn't feel so like, hey, I don't have this, I don't have this. Everybody's talking to me about this, and this, and I don't even feel bad. Like, I don't care. And it's like, I just want, I need something in my life. So, but no, I think, I am actually rather transparent about it now, because I think it's really important to share with the civilian world that, even though I'm 100% disabled veteran, for a bunch of reasons, I can still be productive. I can still live a really fruitful life and really help a lot of people. And I think that civilians sometimes, I constantly get asked when I do use my service dog, oh, are you training that for someone? Because if you look at me, I don't know that people say, like, oh, there's something wrong with that guy. I think I'm like, no, that's my dog. Oh yeah, I know he's your dog, but are you training him for somebody? No, that's my service animal. And then they don't know what to say. Then it's just awkward. Well, geez, what's wrong with you? We get to have a conversation, but I do think it's important. I know very few people that don't struggle with something from their experiences.
No, it's 100% true. And there's so many people on this podcast who have learned to live with it and learned to deal. And it's not something, it's much like anything else, any other disease. There's a sense of incurable to PTSD. It stays with you. You don't escape it. You just learn to manage it. And you learn to live with it as part of your everyday life, because where you were is always part of who you are now.
Yeah. I think what's important, though, is that incurable part of post-traumatic stress is what gave it such a stigma in the military.
Yeah.
Because if it's your brain, it's like, ooh, you can't fix that, psychology, et cetera. And what I've really started to talk to people about, because again, it took me a while to find the right psych, but she was awesome and got me, surfing and doing meditation and the service dog. And like, she got me, and it was a rewiring of the brain, right? So let's look at it as a physiological problem. Let's look at it. Hey, if you tear your ACL, what do? You get it fixed and you go through rehab, and your ACL is never 100% right, but it's pretty good. You can usually go back to doing all the stuff you were doing. I mean, I work with professional athletes that tear their ACL. 6 weeks later, they're back playing games. I look at this as the brain ACL, right? A bunch of different synapses are connecting differently. So if we can rewire those things and we can start to think differently, and we don't get hooked on the cocktail that I think is the easy way out, because it numbs you and then you don't have to think about anything. And we can be a little bit more proactive and have the discipline, which is sometimes doing stuff like, you know what, I'm not going to have a drink tonight, instead of, well, I'm going to have one, which will turn into 6. Or, holy cow, I'm angry right now. So what should I do so I don't act out that anger? And have those physical therapy, for the brain, and have those moments and be able to, and again, do you get it perfectly right? No, but you know what? I busted my leg. I tore my MCL. I tore my meniscus. I tore my Achilles. I can run, but you know what? Some mornings you get out of bed and it hurts. It's the same thing with, hey, you know what? I have 90% good days. And every once in a while, I have a bad day, and I recognize it. And I go, this is just a bad day. This isn't a bad life. But I think it's just like the tears I've got in my legs or my shoulders or whatever. That's part of who I am. My experiences are part of who I am. How my brain was wired is part of who I am. And it's what I choose to do with it to make it better, right? Because you and I probably both know guys that, got medically retired physically because they were broken. And instead of getting back in shape, they just decided to become fat, lazy folks. And I get it, but you don't have to.
No, some of that stuff is a choice, and a difficult one, but certainly is, a lot of times people don't realize how much power they still have, even though things are taken away from them. It's you're not taking your spirit and your mind away. It's just some of the surroundings that are taken away, that change that you have to learn to deal with. Final thought here. As we kind of wrap up, but Kenning Associates is where you're at now. And you mentioned, some of the professional sports teams and everything else you're working with. And how did you get linked up with them, and kind of where are you as far as, I know you're a partner with them, but what's your day-to-day work like?
Oh, wow. I linked up with them through, I had a great guy named Forrest Linkedins who was able to, through the lacrosse world, because I'm very involved in the lacrosse world. I even coach a professional lacrosse team now. And he was able to kind of help me because I had no idea. Once I figured out I was going to get out, I had no idea what to do. After an hour-long conversation with him, his brother was doing leadership consulting, and so I tried it out with his brother and did some contracting work, and I realized, boy, I don't really want to teach like new entry-level managers how to lead, because that's not fun for me. I really want to teach higher-level folks. I created some intellectual property that's in the book. I've created, and I continue to create. I try to create new ones every year, some new stuff, because I think you always have to innovate. And Kenning, we talked for a while, and they liked the intellectual property, and they offered me a partnership. What I've worked to now is I'm the managing partner for the sports practice, and I've really developed kind of a partnership inside of a partnership. So that's the Kenning side, and I get to work with really cool corporations under the Kenning side. But I've linked up with a guy. I don't know, you probably heard of him, Jeff Boss.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay, so Navy SEAL, absolute stud. Another guy named Tim Paul, and another guy named James Stagnita. So Tim Paul was a surface warfare officer. James Stagnita, 30-year coach at the Division I collegiate, Division III, Division I, Ivy, and now professional level coach. 30 years, like one of the most winning, had an undefeated season in the professional ranks. Division III, absolute, killer, was at Rutgers as a lacrosse coach. Guy's a stud. And so the four of us have really started to push hard together on kind of the sports teams. So what's really neat is my days are completely different, and I like it. So I'll do leadership with anyone from a private equity firm one day and talking to the partners of that, to sitting down with an entire defensive coaching staff of a professional football team, talking to a head coach of an NBA team the next afternoon, maybe working with law enforcement for a couple of days after that, teaching them about empathy and leadership and ethical decision making. And then I write frequently, and I'm starting a webinar. In March, middle of March, I'll offer a webinar with 8 classes, also taught by Jeff and Tim and Jim, where we'll provide the same kind of advisory support to our web audience as we do to our professional audience. So, and I like that. Like, I like to be able to relate what I'm learning from law enforcement and what they're going through right now to what I learned from a professional football coach or a football player about what he's struggling with, and be able to relate it to that equity firm or that law firm, and that kind of diversity, right? So the business. I just started working with a school. I've done schools before, but I really started working with a school recently in a little bit more of a permanent basis, where I'm helping them kind of do a paradigm shift on how they see themselves. Because one of the things I do is I work culture. How do we develop deliberate cultures? And so I'm helping them build a culture. I built the Denver Broncos culture before they won the Super Bowl. The Carolina Panthers culture was done, but I got to do Xbox, a whole bunch of different cultures. And so working with all those different folks and being able to take, what I had, and then not just resting on what I've had as the military experience, but then being able to say, holy cow, I was at Johns Hopkins, Coach Petramala, who's, the head coach of Johns Hopkins lacrosse, who's a tremendous leader. I just saw him do this. And you know what, Sheriff so-and-so, that would really work for you. And I think the clients like that as well.
No, that's incredible. I mean, listen, your military career is impressive, to say the least. Your personal story is certainly courageous, and your post-military career is inspirational. And I just thank you so much for sharing it all with us, honesty, candor, all that. And we could talk leadership for hours and days on end, you and I, because there's just so much more I'd love to listen to and learn. And unfortunately, our podcast can't go days long, but I know everybody who listened to this one certainly got a lot from it. And I appreciate everything that you've done tonight, man.
Well, hey, thank you. And thank you for everything you've done. And thank you for creating this pathway for all of us to be able to share with our community, our world community. So that really means a lot to me, because the more stories that are out there, the less strange it seems when we run into others.
Absolutely. JC Glick, thanks for being part of the Hazard Ground.
Thank you so much.
You've been listening to the Hazard Ground Podcast, hosted by Mark Zeno and produced by Matt Pasquarella. If you have an interesting story to tell and you'd like to be on the show, send us an email at hazardgroundpodcast@gmail.com. And if you like the show, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.